From WABE in Atlanta, this is Savory Stories, a show where we take a look at Atlanta's people through its cuisine and food history.
On this podcast, we trace Atlanta's food story from the past to the present, getting to know Atlanta's culinary creators and demystifying stereotypes about food.
I'm Chef Asita Reed, owner of Life Chef, where we help you live a life you love, and author of How to Feed a Kid, A Parent's Guide.
And I'm Akilah McConnell, culinary historian and author of A Culinary History of Atlanta, and owner of Unexpected Atlanta Tours, the #1 rated tour company in the city. Today, we are talking about that essential morning beverage, coffee.
Akilah, I think you meant manna from the gods because Atlanta runs on coffee.
So, true story, Asta, I made it through law school, 4 years working as an attorney and being a mom to 2 kids, and never took up coffee.
That's crazy talk.
It actually blows people's mind, but we have a completely caffeine-free household. But though I don't drink coffee regularly, I certainly appreciate coffee and coffee cultures. I've toured coffee plantations across Central and South America and learned a lot about coffee in our own city, so I'm really excited to get into this discussion today.
Not gonna lie, at one point, coffee had replaced blood in my veins, so I'm really curious to hear how Atlanta's connected to this rich, dark source of life.
So let's start way back. Coffee grown worldwide can trace its heritage back to ancient coffee forests in Ethiopia. A legend goes that a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats dancing after eating berries from a tree that made them very energetic. He brought the berries to a local monastery, which made a drink with the berries. And the drink allowed the monks to stay awake through the long hours of evening prayer. That drink was made from coffee Arabica. And today, coffee Arabica represents about 60% of global coffee production. But here's the interesting thing. Though early Ethiopians cultivated many types of grains, including teff and others, they did not begin cultivating coffee until the 1500s.
I love that story because we have our own Dancing Goats coffee shops located here in Atlanta, in Midtown, Buckhead, Decatur, Ponce City Market, and Emory. Dancing Goats is committed to low-impact sustainability practices. The brand originated in 1988 in Olympia, Washington, but to date, they have more Atlanta locations than any other city, and they've been here at least 25 years, which I think speaks to the popularity of their coffee and unofficially makes Dancing Goats an AT alien. I'm pretty sure 20 years of residency. After that, the city just claims you. What do you say, Akilah?
Absolutely. And, I love their Decatur location. It's super bright and open. And, part of the reason that Dancing Goats is so successful in Atlanta is they have a roastery right here in the city in the Cabbagetown neighborhood. And Asita, roasting is a really big part of the trick to get great coffee, right?
Right. While coffee's been produced for centuries, the production method hasn't really changed that much. The first thing to know about coffee is the coffee bean isn't really a bean. It's actually the pit of a coffee cherry. Coffee cherries ripen in clusters on coffee trees, ripening to a bright red color on those lush, dark green leaves. And each coffee cherry has 2 pits in it, which are dried. The green coffee seeds have a very grassy flavor, similar to an herbal tea. But the magic happens when the green coffee seeds are roasted and transformed into what we know as the coffee bean. Roasted coffee contains over 800 separate flavors and aromas, mostly created in the roasting process, and it is magic.
It is magic. And the interesting thing is that coffee's drinking worldwide is a relatively recent thing. Coffee is something that the world has only known for around 500 years. So as I mentioned, the Ethiopians didn't start cultivating coffee until around the 1500s. Around that point, coffee made its way across the Middle East from Persia to Egypt, Syria, and Turkey by travelers. And coffee came to be used by Sufi monks to fast in the day and stay awake at night, while wealthy people began to use it for Muslim ceremonies. But because it was a stimulant like wine, for a short while, conservative imams in the 1500s issued a fatwa banning the drink.
Oof, that must have been a harsh adjustment.
Well, interestingly, that coffee ban might actually have raised the profile of coffee because the elite in Turkey, including the Ottoman Sultan, were coffee drinkers, and their efforts led to the ban being overruled. The visibility of coffee became even higher. Today, coffee is one of the few stimulants that is universally considered halal and permitted to be drunk by Muslims. And our relationship with coffee today, even here in Atlanta, is very much tied to this early history of the drink. In fact, our English word coffee originated from the Turkish word kahve and the Arabic word kawa.
So how did drinking coffee become a mainstream social practice?
Yeah, so that actually has a lot to do with coffee houses. Now, the first coffee houses were recorded in Istanbul in the 1500s, where they were known as kahvekhana. And this was a place where people socialized and engaged in active conversations. The coffee house culture soon spread across the Middle East, and in big cities in Iran, they were established as a place where poets, writers, artists, and members of the royalty would meet, and they came to be known as, and I quote, schools for the wise.
Well, I'm definitely claim more wisdom and better conversation skills after my morning cup.
Yeah, Turkish people definitely felt the same way. They actually carefully guarded their monopoly over coffee trees. They didn't allow any germinating berries to leave the country. But sometime during the 1600s, a Muslim pilgrim smuggled out 7 seeds by taping them to his stomach, and then he cultivated them in southern India in the mountains of Mysore, where soon Dutch colonists transported the trees to Java and to Sumatra in the East Indies.
Ooh, stealing, smuggling, international espionage. Coffee has a dark history.
It does indeed, and it was considered a particularly black drink by Christians. In the early 1600s, European travelers started raving about what they called the wine of Persia, because the Arabic word kahve literally means wine. So in 1605, at the height of the Spanish Inquisition, Christian priests tried to get the Pope to ban coffee in Europe, describing it as a Muslim drink. Well, the Pope tasted coffee, and he stated, and I quote, "This Satan's drink is so delicious, we shall fool Satan by baptizing it and making a truly Christian beverage."
What? What in the gaslighting thought process is that?
I know it. But you know, the interesting thing is at the same time, Europeans were colonizing the Americas, and it's apparent that coffee had become quite a craze since the first American coffee house opened in Boston in 1689. So this is a full 100 years before we had a constitution, before we had a Declaration of Independence, we had coffee houses. At the same time, Europeans were colonizing the Americas, and it's apparent that coffee had become quite the craze since the first American coffee house opened in Boston in 1689. So that's almost 100 years before we had a constitution, before we had a Declaration of Independence, we had coffee houses. And then King George issued the Stamp Act of 1765, which prompted that famous no taxation without representation protest and the Boston Tea Parties. Well, colonists began to believe that it was a patriotic American duty to avoid drinking tea, and instead they began drinking coffee. You won't believe it, Asada, but between 1772 to 1799, coffee consumption increased 7-fold in this country.
Wow. So now I can see why modern America is so enamored with coffee. It became our patriotic duty to drink it, and I don't think we've looked back. After a quick break, we'll talk a bit about the relationship between coffee and colonization.
Coffee, as we know it, is quite bitter, and sugar made it palatable to many consumers. So we have these two substances, coffee and sugar, which both require really high levels of labor and huge amounts of land, and they're growing in popularity in the 1700s. This is the same time when the transatlantic slave trade was at its peak. So European monarchies began colonizing Africa and kidnapping and enslaving African people to bring to the Americas to work on these sugar and coffee plantations.
You know, to this day, I offer coffee, sugar, tobacco, and rice to honor my West African ancestors. So many people were brought here to cultivate these staples, and now they're a part of many Americans' everyday experiences. I think it's important to acknowledge the expertise and labor and lives that were given so that these crops could be so significant in the agricultural wealth of the Americas.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of those places that coffee and sugar were heavily produced was in Haiti. By 1788, San Domingo in Haiti produced 50% of the world's coffee and 30% of the world's sugar supply. But that was all because of the huge enslaved population there. In 1791, 87% of the colony of Haiti was enslaved, with over 480,000 enslaved Africans. But these hundreds and thousands of enslaved people lived in appalling conditions. And this is where the story turns. In 1791, led by Toussaint Louverture, the enslaved people of Haiti revolted in a struggle for freedom that lasted 12 years. The enslaved of Haiti succeeded, overthrowing France, and they became the only major successful slave revolt in history. The impacts of the Haitian Revolution were profound and led to the independence of the enslaved in Haiti, the abolition of slavery, and the transcontinental slave trade by France, Spain, and England.
We owe a debt of gratitude to Haitian revolutionaries for demanding freedom for the descendants of Africa in the West. Akila, how did coffee gain popularity in the South? After all, we call sweet tea the table wine of the South because it's cool and refreshing. Coffee is hot, bitter, and strong.
You're right, and that actually has a lot to do with the Civil War. When the United States went to civil war, while coffee was drunk in the United States and here in the South, it certainly wasn't as popular as ale, whiskey, and tea. But during the Civil War, the Union issued a blockade on coffee, preventing coffee from reaching the South completely. And what it did was it allotted 36 pounds of coffee to Union soldiers per year. That is a lot of coffee. On the other hand, here in Atlanta, coffee sold for $15 per pound in 1861, and I'm going to tell you how much that is. In today's money, that would be $530 per pound of coffee today. Are you going to buy that, Asada?
What? That is wild. I mean, only the super wealthy could afford that.
Not even them, I think. And, one thing that I find is when I read old newspaper accounts or diaries about the Civil War, especially here in the South, Southerners used to describe alternatives to coffee. Confederate soldiers subsisted on drinks made by boiling dandelion roots or dried okra. There was an enslaved man in Atlanta named George Womble who remembered that they drank a type of coffee made by parching bran or meal and boiling it in water. Real coffee was so scarce here in Atlanta that one Atlanta jeweler during the Civil War set coffee beans in breastpins instead of diamonds. At the same time, the stimulant of coffee was helping to keep the Union soldiers awake and alert, and it probably helped them win the Civil War.
Is this why chicory became so popular in the South?
It is. A chicory is not coffee, but it is rather a root. And during the Civil War, people cut it up, dried it, and roasted it, resulting in a coffee-like beverage that didn't have any of the caffeine. And you've probably tried the chicory coffee at Café du Monde in New Orleans, and it also developed during the Civil War timeframe. Now, once the war ended, coffee no longer became a drink for the elite, but rather a drink for the masses. And that had a great deal to do with the growth of Atlanta's industries post-Civil War. As workers came back to Atlanta, entrepreneurs began developing industrial mills, and they wanted their laborers working as long and as hard as possible. In those days, there were no labor laws, so laborers worked 6 days per week at 12 hours per day. And mill owners began offering coffee to laborers at cheap prices or for free to keep their employees awake and working.
Okay, so at this point, coffee was like today's energy drinks, fueling people just to get through working long hours.
That is exactly right. And it's also kind of the reason why it's a given that there's going to be free coffee in any office in the country. It goes back to these Industrial Revolution roots. Coffee became particularly popular when you were heading on and off the train from Atlanta. In 1884, there was a man named Henry Durand who he developed the city's top restaurant at the Union Station, and he was particularly famous for his coffee. Asada, you're going to love this. Are you a big fan of coffee?
Yes.
Okay.
Bring it on.
Well, Henry Durand purchased Java and Arabian mocha directly from suppliers. His coffee was roasted in a special instrument that he created and designed entirely by himself, kind of similar to an Italian espresso machine. But here's the kicker. He had an exclusive contract with Smith's Dairy in LaGrange, Georgia, for 40 gallons of milk per day. The cows would be milked at 3 a.m. The milk would immediately be put on the train where it was sent up 60 miles to Atlanta packed in ice, it would reach Duran's restaurant at 6 a.m. so that the farm-fresh milk and cream could be served with Duran's coffee.
Wow, now that's fresh. Imagine the milk for your coffee from cow to cup in 3 hours.
Amazing, right?
Right. Akilah, before I dive into Atlanta's coffee scene, I want to give a shout out to two of Atlanta's OG cafes where I learned the difference between an espresso and a cappuccino. Cafe Intermezzo is a popular European-style cafe boasting fresh pastries, an extensive bar, and ambiance perfect for a date night. For over 40 years, this family-owned business delivered an intermission between life's hustle and bustle with live music, local art, and a menu that is great for sharing tapas or delving into hearty fare. It was here that I had my very first cappuccino about 100 years ago and sipped Benedictine warmed by my hand in a snifter. Now Cafe Intermezzo has 3 Georgia locations, plus Epic Bakery in Decatur, and a location in North Carolina. Akilah, I'm sure you have some Cafe Intermezzo memories.
Absolutely. Back in the day, it was in this tiny little shop down on Peachtree Street, and it used to always be packed with people. You used to stand in front of their massive counter to pick out one of it felt like hundreds of dessert selections. Great OG choice.
Yes, definitely. I also want to shout out one more OG cafe, and that's Après Diem in Midtown in the landmark Cinema Plaza. Après Diem opened in 2000 after its sister location, Cafe Diem, which started in the Ponce Highlands, opened back in 1992. Here again, we see the art, live music, DJs, and food come together to create a vibe that's been running for decades. My mother and I come here every year, eat mussels, and sip kava on our birthdays. But again, this is one of the first places I experienced a European cafe service and espresso drinks. Today, Atlanta boasts coffee importers, roasters, and coffee bars that are focused on the beverages and beans or cherries outside of the play between coffee and food.
If you've ever wondered what espresso is all about, espresso is not a type of coffee bean. I'm going to say that again. Espresso is not a type of coffee bean. As I mentioned up at the top, there are 2 types of coffee beans used across the world. Coffee Arabica, which is that original Ethiopian coffee, and coffee Robusta. Espresso, it's just a method of coffee production. Basically, espresso is made by forcing very hot water under high pressure through finely ground and compacted coffee, resulting in this thicker coffee. The trick to espresso is not the bean, but rather the type of espresso machine you have and the skill of the barista.
And we could go on and on about different types of espresso machines and our favorite baristas. But speaking of skill and favorite baristas, I want to give an RIP out to Hodgepodge Coffee. This Southeast Moreland Avenue coffee shop expanded to 2 shops, then retracted back to the original that kept many East Atlantans and their businesses afloat during the pandemic. A lot of folks rolled up into Hodgepodge with their laptops, but after 12 years, they've announced that they will be closing due to rent hikes. Another RIP goes out to Buzz Coffee and Wine House at the Point on Cascade. They didn't last nearly as long, but they came in early as a Black-owned business in a predominantly Black neighborhood that was experiencing massive growth and development. They will be missed. So now, let's get into some of our favorite spots, Akilah.
Sounds good to me. And one of my top choices is Banjo Coffee and Avondale Estates. In addition to drip coffee and espresso drinks, they're known for their nitro cold brew, which they make in-house. Now, nitro cold brew means that they place coffee grounds into a pitcher with cold water, and then they let it steep for usually around 24 hours. And at the end, they infuse it with nitrogen gas right before it's poured. That nitrogen results in a thicker and creamier cold brew. And if you really love it, you can even buy Banjo Coffee's cold brew to take home with you. If you're there, I also really like some of their specialty drinks like their lavender honey latte, and in the holiday season, they offer up a gingerbread nitro latte.
Ooh, that sounds good. I want to highlight a few Black-owned coffee spaces in Atlanta. We've got the Black Coffee Company on Jonesboro Road, which is super cute, urban, and on point for meetings. All the small business owners gather here between the plants, the merch, and the small tables to make their moves. It's a Black-owned haven on the south side of Atlanta. La Raya's Bodega in Ponce City Market is a whole vibe. It's coffee, it's vegan, it's music, and if you find yourself lingering, it's totally okay because you need some of that Nuyorican black girl magic in your life.
Sounds amazing. I haven't been there yet, but you make me want to go. Any other great choices?
Yeah, we've got Portrait Coffee. Their CEO, Aaron Fender, and team are pouring a new narrative when it comes to coffee. This roaster, retailer, and cafe is located in Atlanta's historic West End community and is committed to showing the people of color in the past and present of coffee who reside in places like Ethiopia, Brazil, Vietnam, and Colombia. On the website, Portrait Coffee states, "What was once merely a drink of necessity turned into an ode of our ancestors. After learning the history and seeing the current realities, every cup of coffee made and consumed felt like an invitation to drink purpose, meaning, fulfillment." I was like, wow, that's deep.
It is. It is indeed. That whole history of coffee that we've been talking about.
Right. Today, their entire team is composed of residents of Atlanta who are deeply invested in seeing the historic West End continue to flourish. Portrait Coffee was selected by Lottie Watkins and her family to take up residence in the Lottie Watkins building on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard. And I'm sure you know, Lottie Watkins was Atlanta's first Black woman to be a licensed real estate broker.
Awesome. So great.
Yep. And there's so many more. I mean, Atlanta has coffee shops. If you throw a rock, you're going to hit one. So if you're interested in exploring Atlanta's coffee scene, check out the website atlantacoffeeshops.com, which will pull up a map of coffee shops across the city.
Well, we hope we've got you all caffeinated and ready for your day. Thank you all for joining Savory Stories. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you do that kind of thing with your favorite podcast.
We'll be back in a few weeks with a new episode. See you then.
Savory Stories is produced by Crystal Devone and Kevin Rinker, with additional production and editing from Scotty Crow. The series was created by Summer Evans and premiered on City Lights with Lois Reitzes. For more info, visit wabe.org/Savory Stories.
WABE.